We anticipate in the next 10 to 12 years approximately 8 to 6 million Hispanics coming into the United States and 41 million Asians. You have been the majority minority for 400 years in this country. You have been the number 2 population for 400 years. You're going to get kicked out of being number 2. You're going to go down and become number 4. Now, common sense, even a 3rd grade education would tell you, if you didn't get anything when you were number 2, you all jumped ahead of me, but anyway, you can guess what you're going to get when you become number 4.
President Biden, do you support reparations?
Well, I mean, since I haven't spoken on this, got a chance. Number one, the reason we're the country we are is because of immigration. We've been able to cherry pick the best from every single continent. The people who come here have determination, resilience. They are ready to stand up and work like the devil. We have 24 out of every 100 children in our school today is Hispanic. The idea that we are going to walk away and not provide every opportunity for them is not only stupid and immoral, but it's bad for America. They are the future of America.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Now, this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
We are owed $104 trillion on the very low end, plus $735 billion recurring. This number does not include the cost of about 50 Black Wall Streets that were decimated, nor compound interest from 2017 when Sean D. Rochester's book, The Black Tax, was published, nor the cost of Black life, nor the cost of living increases, nor the war on drugs, nor the current day pandemic. The number I'm working with is for slavery, Jim Crow, and accrued ongoing systemic racism, oppression, and disadvantage in the country our ancestors built with their lives. Good afternoon on the West Coast. Good afternoon in the mountain. Good afternoon in the central. Good afternoon on the East Coast. You know exactly who it is, family. Angela Nirvana, your hostess with the mostest on the reparationist perspective, bringing you those frequent hot topics and making the case for reparations, weaponizing our vote, socializing our suffering. Welcome back, family. California Reparations Task Force Day 2, Part 2. We're in Oakland, California. Hold on, family. I hear somebody at the door. Hello? Oh, that must have been my dryer, y'all. I'm trying to get one more fit out the dryer before I travel. How y'all doing, family? Welcome back. Let me see if they back yet. Child the ghetto. I hear some murmurings, but let's get that going. Hold on so I can remove that. Okay. Hold on, family. Let me share my screen. I don't want to miss them. It was an epic Part 1, Day 2. And we're back, Day 2, Part 2. Yeah, family. If you were here, you must go and watch the archives. You must. I see you, Adrian Taylor. Greetings, no bull. Perfect introduction, darling. Thank you, family. That's my incomparable musician of a brother, Robert Sanae, Sanae. That he scored the music. I mean, he didn't really score it. This song that he's granted me permission to use is on, I think, his sophomore or freshman album. Check him out, the CD Baby. How Bootney Lee Farnsworth is a tether. I see you, family, in the building. But yes, so basically, ETM, Amend the Mass Media Group, Umoya was the one to put the visual to my brother's music to make for an epic introduction and a constant reminder of the debt that is owed in the quadrillions over multiple generations, okay? As far as I'm concerned, they're going to have to pay until they get their boots up off our necks, period. Literally and in theory, okay? That's what I believe, okay? As long as you're oppressing us, it's for as long as you've got to pay. When you're done being a glacier donkey that loves to kill, steal, and destroy, then we can have a conversation. I don't think that's ever going to happen because that's how many of them are wired. But the bottom line is we're here for day 2, part 2. I won't be able to keep it lit in the chat, so I'm going to rely on you guys as my co-host to keep it going. My daughter is here to end the live when they're done for the day. And we're just waiting for them to get it going. I got to zip up my suitcase. I'm going to see my niece graduate from college, and I am just so ecstatic I can hardly contain myself. But I got to get to the LAX. Y'all know how that is. If you know anything about LA, you know that's a job just getting to the airport, okay? So I can't stay here long. So I'm going to put y'all on a brief, we just going to stay here until they go live, and then I'll narrow myself, and I will make the screen bigger for them. But I do hear some murmurings in the back, which means they're probably coming back very, very shortly. So stand by, family, stand by. I'm going to mute my mic so you don't hear me running around this house like crazy, okay? All right.
I have so much information from you. I don't even know if I need to stay. Because you have enlightened me. You have answered just about everything I wanted to know. I would say everything. I want you to know that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Very informative. God always sends you to his children, to the right people.
I appreciate that. Especially these days, I've been a little, I don't know, like the end of the year, ready to rest.
Yes, yes.
We're moving kind of slow.
Well, I'm full of energy and I'm always ready to go, especially when it comes to learning. So when I made 80 on my birthday, September 28th, I began to feel a little different. And for about 2 or 3 weeks, I was a little discombobulated, and I couldn't figure it out. So one day, I'm standing in my kitchen. It's Tuesday or Thursday, about 2:30 in the afternoon. I'm standing in my kitchen at my kitchen sink. And all I could do, sure as I said, the sun is shining. And said to me, "You're in a new chapter in your life. You're in a new chapter." And it was clear. It was clear. As God is my witness in all of heaven. That's true. Because I was so, I said, okay, I'm 80 and I'm going into, I don't know. And I'm not hurting, I'm not in pain, but as I was saying, I was a little discombobulated.
Y'all, they slow coming back as usual, but we're still live. Just stand by, family. Thank you for being here. Please don't forget to like, share, support, subscribe. Turn on your notifications, okay? Please like, share, subscribe, turn on your notifications. I'll wave my banner for a minute. If you want to get involved, we're fighting all over the country. Let me help you understand something, family. I know folks is like, no, just let the feds do it. We've been waiting for 500 years for the feds to do a damn thing. They ain't done just that, a damn thing. So, no, there's lots of little bills propping up all throughout the country. I'm telling you right now, if you're not at the table, you're going to be on the menu. Because these grifters and these Pan-Africanists, they want everybody to get it. And that's not how any of this is going to work. You got Asians and white folks sitting up here right now on Capitol Hill. Okay? They sitting up on Capitol Hill trying to end. Do you hear me? And they're trying to close the gate on our affirmative action now that their median income is around $150,000 a year. They're trying to permanently lock us out. So y'all can sit up here and say all this foolishness about only wanting a federal check. I'll take my check from the Cherokee. I'll take my check from the state. I'll take it from the city. I'll take it from the county. And I'll take it from the feds. You understand what I'm telling you? Don't listen to people niggerly tell you they can't do it. Because that's what they're trying to convince you of, to give you more programs. They give away with the left and give away with the right. I see you, Shirley Huzar. Welcome back, my love. Shirley Huzar in the building, y'all. Adrian, did I say hello? Yes, no bullshit. I see you. And to those of you tuning in from Twitter, from Facebook, welcome back, family. Welcome back. Day 2, part 2. But yeah, so what we ended up doing was taking this project over out here, that AB 3121. At CJEC, we found that. Made friends with the author of the bill. She's now the Secretary of State. Amen. Lineage-based only. No Pan-Africanists. That's right, family. The gate is up. S. Ross Serrano. Okay? The gate is up. Like I told folks, you about to find out how many black folks we really got in this country. I see you, Eco Hair Braiders. Thank you for joining the live, fam. You about to see we around 100 million. Watch this reparations bring everybody out the damn woodwork. They gonna come up off the paint. All the way down to the one drop room. They about to do all that, family. We got to put the gate up, lock the door, and close away the Mickey Ficky key. I see you, Evanston, Illinois. Oh, S. Ross Arano says Evanston, Illinois supports TF. I don't know what TF means, but I do know that Evanston's on some bullshitty because Narcan and Cobra is over that. Them folks got a housing voucher. They don't even qualify for no home loans on no $40,000 a year median income. Evanston is full of black immigrants. And they done tied the reparations to marijuana taxes. Okay, about 16 people qualified. They can't even get their little stuff up out the piece. So lots of games being played, family. Y'all need to get involved. If you want to get involved, Gmail me at thereprespect@gmail.com. It's scrolling in the bar below. I'm not going to be here long. I'm just trying to wait for them to go live so I can get out of here. Y'all chat amongst yourself. Keep the chat lit. Remember your educators. Evanston, Illinois supports task force. Yeah, they support the ones who was for race-based reparations. That much I know. You know, Reginald Jones Sawyer and Lisa Holder, Don Tamaki, Cheryl Grills. They all voted for race-based reparations, even though Chemerinsky told them if you do it based on race, they're going to appeal this at the Supreme Court level. You'll never see a dime.
They don't give a damn as long as they ain't got to trade places with American freedmen. But we coming up off this bottom. This is Evanston rejects racist reparations. Well, I ain't never heard of them. And a housing voucher ain't reparations. Just like freeing Brittany Griner, that ain't reparations. Just like Barack Obama, he ain't reparations. Folks seem to need to get a clear understanding about what is and is not reparations. Only when it comes to American freedmen. They can run that cold Skrilla over to all these other groups. They can run that Skrilla to the Jews whose Holocaust we never participated in.
As you can see,
we are resistance against false reparations in Evanston.
Oh,
well, thank you for being here. S. Ross Serrano.
So you
need to hit me
back
up.
And forth. Locks your pan.
You need to hit me up at the Retrospective Gmail.
Locked.
Oh, so that's the only movement I need to do?
Yeah, baby, I'm gonna try to relax.
Your tilt.
Okay.
I can't even take my laptop.
If you unlock both of them, you can move it where it needs to be. And like something like that.
That's how much I love y'all.
Would be fine.
They talking, y'all. Y'all can hear them, but they ain't turned the cameras on yet.
And then when that's over.
But yeah, family, get
like,
at the tables, find your reparations bills, edit those. Edited based on our AB 3121. Find the author, find a sponsor, and make sure nothing but freedmen is at that task force table.
Okay, so
that's what
you're
you
gonna
best
relay
to do.
that to me.
Are you going to fool around and waste a year?
Like I'm on camera too.
Just to fight for lineage-based repair.
But if he's like, okay,
who knew
I'm
we
on
had to
camera
fight
3,
black folks just
camera
to
3
get
take, then you just stay
the
where you're at.
reparations done? I never dreamed it in all my life.
Okay. We have a
all right, y'all. I'm a mute so I can finish over here.
Another one.
Gotcha.
So you can hear us. Well, you will need one if you're up here.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's the 3 seats, but then I think Johnson is the seat here.
The one over there. Okay. Yeah.
So here is the other thing you'd have to control possibly.
The zoom.
The zoom. Wide, tight, back and forth. You don't have to do anything with it though. They'll ask you to record as we're about to start. All you do is hit this red button.
Okay.
And then it'll say record.
They say record. And then there's nothing to do with like battery, nothing like that, right?
No, you got house power.
Pan, tilt, zoom. Yeah. Don't move the camera when it's when the camera's on yours. Okay. And then
unless you can make a nice smooth movement.
Oh yeah, I can. That's what I was gonna ask you. Like, how fast should the pan be gonna happen? So.
I mean, if he's not on you, then you can go as fast as you need to go.
Gotcha.
So then, let me see here. Yeah, so you will have to unlock these. Nothing should ever feel forced. So if it's locked, you're like, it's not moving, and you push on it or whatever, it's gonna not be good for the lock.
Right. It's straining.
So up is unlocked, down is locked.
Okay. Do you mind if I try it real quick, and you can maybe suggest whether or not I need to keep things tighter or?
It's hard to, without the people being down there.
Oh, telling you
to see them, to get the right framing.
Gotcha. So right now it's all locked.
Yeah.
If I want to pan over to Michael, are you guys gonna tell me like?
And everything's on auto, so you don't have to worry about focus. It should just auto focus for you.
Gotcha. And then I'll like lock it here.
And then you can lock it.
And then let's say Doretha needs to be conversed. You tell me off it's on a different camera. Then I can move it. And then kind of just lock it in, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you can, for like the majority of, you can just sit in the seat.
Yeah.
And just like, you don't have to be super fast or anything and do it like, oh, they need me now. Like,
gotcha. And then for the most part, it's just setting it up to the point where, for example, most likely it's going to be the witness table and them talking. I just got to just set it there.
Right.
And then you guys will advise me to.
Yeah, so like if it looks like somebody on the dais is having a conversation with DOJ, then we would just focus on people in DOJ.
So it's like kind of self-directed, but you guys will remind me or tell me.
Right.
Move it up to those days. Okay.
Yeah, like if Oscar needs to remind you, hey, can you get DOJ or whatever, and then the witness table. So
Gotcha.
that would be the only other one, and you're only going to know, like, they'll start talking, and then you'd be like, oh, I'll go over there.
Yeah.
And then
If it's off my camera.
if it's off your camera, yeah.
Gotcha. And then
And if you're moving, he might come up, like, it's not life or death, so don't be too stressed.
Hey, thank you, Justin.
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna need one of those headsets, but
I'll go get one.
I'll be happy to.
Or we can go down there and get one.
Yeah, sure.
And then when he says record, it's up on the top handle. Well, whatever. He's kind of at our disposal.
Whatever you guys want me to do.
So only when she goes and gets the car.
You're saying only when she goes to get the car?
It's up to you.
How comfortable are you?
I mean, Justin was pretty thorough, and he told me the two main areas I'd pan into or tip to. So. Yeah, I'm happy to help if you guys are confident or comfortable with it. So. No worries. All right, yeah.
That's it. Yeah, we'll go get you.
I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I've always wanted to do this, so it's cool. You know?
Throw you into the fire.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm gonna be pinned into the wall or something. So, yeah, I think we should go down.
And the other part is. I see most of it. I watch more of it. Oh, it's my wife's actually considering that one. I try to follow.
I just left it. Oh, let me take a picture. I'm gonna send a picture saying, this is and I'm eating and I said, you need to tell him how I had to touch you on. Yeah, but I'm just trying to see. And I'm just thinking about it the day when I'm next time. I know I just keep something, but I still and you were nice to us, making offers, and I said, and then I but I left you. Dr. Brown, how are you?
All right, task force members, we will begin business very promptly. If we can get to our seats now, that would be great. Welcome back, members of the public and task force members. Before we resume business, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson to reestablish a quorum, and please excuse our delay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will begin with the chair. Excuse me, Chair Moore.
Present.
Chair Moore is present. Vice Chair Brown.
Present.
Vice Chair Brown is present. Member Bradford. Member Bradford is present. Member Grills. Member Grills is present. Member Holder. Present. Member Holder is present. Member Jones Sawyer. Member Jones Sawyer is present. Member Lewis. Member Lewis is present. Member Montgomery Stepp. Member Montgomery Stepp is absent. Member Tamaki. Member Tamaki is present. Madam, excuse me, Madam Chair, the task force consists of 9 members. 5 are necessary for a quorum. There are 8 members present. A quorum has been reestablished.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. Now that a quorum has been reestablished, we will resume. The next item on our agenda is item number 17, discussion and potential action, advisory committee's preliminary recommendations on potential remedies, remedial programs, laws, and apologies for atrocities, chapter 2 and 9, on enslavement and cultural, creative, and intellectual life. I'll wait for the slides to appear. Folks. So I am honored to be on this advisory committee for Chapter 2 and Chapter 9. Before I begin, I want to give a special thanks to the September and December 2021 personal expert witnesses that provided testimony on Chapters 2 and Chapters 9. Also, I want to give a special thanks to Vince Kazawi, the Deputy Attorney General, Jeremy Payne, Associate Governmental Program Analyst, and Newton and Nose, Deputy Attorney General, for working alongside me these past 2 months for this presentation. Next slide, please. So the first are preliminary recommendations regarding enslavement, as well as recommendations on the establishment of a California African American Freedmen Affairs Agency, which was a recommendation in our interim report as a preliminary recommendation. Next slide, please. As a reminder for folks, California was complicit in perpetuating the institution of slavery. A gold rush source estimated that 1,500 enslaved African Americans lived in California in 1852. And that is a source from Professor Stacy Smith, who gave expert testimony September 2021. Next slide, please. Not only that, California's legislature and courts sent an important message. They were friendly to the Southern enslaving states. They believed enslaved people should have no legal rights, and they thought that the U.S. Constitution should protect enslavers and enslavement. Also, instead of just covering people who escaped across state lines, California's law said that a fugitive slave was any enslaved person who arrived before California officially became a U.S. state in September 1850, but who refused to return to the enslaving states with their enslavers. So the implications of that California Fugitive Slave Act was that these people could be arrested, placed under the control of their enslavers, and forced to return to the South. Next slide, please. So the following recommendations are preliminary recommendations for Chapter 2 on enslavement, and they're categorized under the forms of reparations under international law. So we'll first start with satisfaction, which deals with more symbolic forms of reparations. And so what we came up with is the Reparations Task Force may consider recommending the California State Legislature sponsor a resolution that would issue a formal apology on behalf of the state of California for allowing enslavement, adoption of the fugitive slave laws, and subsequent enforcement opposing Reconstruction civil rights laws. Also, in our interim report, you'll find that the California State Legislature delayed the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments until the late 20th century. And so the advisory committee determined that there should be a potential apology on behalf of the state legislature for its delayed ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Also, the Reparations Task Force may consider recommending the California State Legislature sponsor a legal resolution affirming the state's protection of descendants of enslaved people and to guarantee to protect the civil, political, and sociocultural rights of descendants of enslaved people. Next slide. In terms of rehabilitation and restitution, the Reparations Task Force may consider recommending proposals to emphasize rehabilitation in California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. So what that means is the task force can consider recommending a policy that makes education, substance use, and mental health treatment and rehabilitative programs the first priority for incarcerated people. This proposal is meant to ensure that rehabilitation in CDCR is prioritized. The Reparations Task Force may also recommend legislation allowing incarcerated folks to vote and a policy requiring that incarcerated people who are working in prison or jail be paid a fair market rate for their labor. And these two recommendations coincide with one another in the sense that you provide incarcerated folks a fair market rate for their labor, that is helping to emphasize rehabilitation in CDCR, and so that they can gain more skills, they can have more capital, so when they are eventually released, they can become more productive members of society. Next slide, please. In terms of guarantees of non-repetition, to the point, a lot of our recommendations in terms of the different advisory committees definitely overlap. And so for this item, under guarantees of non-repetition for recommendations related to enslavement, the Reparations Task Force may consider recommending proposals to end voluntary servitude by proposing to delete language from the California Constitution that permits involuntary servitude as a punishment for a crime by passing what was formerly Assembly Constitutional Amendment ACA 3. Also, a recommendation would be to abolish the death penalty, as we know has disproportionately affected African Americans. Next slide, please. So the next set of recommendations relates to the establishment of a California Freedmen's Bureau, which, as I stated before, is in our interim report as a set of preliminary recommendations. The Reparations Task Force may consider recommending the California State Legislature create a California Freedmen's Bureau in recognition of perpetuating and maintaining slavery and its afterlife. This bureau, and again, these are sets of recommendations that are in our interim report, would contain a branch to process claims with the state and assist claimants in filing for eligibility, a genealogy branch in order to support potential claimants with genealogical research and to confirm eligibility, a reparations tribunal in order to adjudicate substantive claims for past harms, an office of immediate relief to expedite claims, particularly for the most vulnerable populations within the African American descendants of the slave community, like the homeless, for instance, a civic engagement branch to support ongoing political education on African American history and to support civic engagement among African American youth, a Freedmen Education branch to offer free education and to facilitate the free tuition initiative between claimants and California state-funded schools and universities. Next slide, please. The Reparations Task Force may consider, again, recommending the legislature create a California Freedmen's Bureau with the following branches as well: a Social Services and Family Affairs branch to identify and mitigate the ways that current and previous policies have damaged and destabilized Black families, Services might include treatment for trauma and family healing services to strengthen the family unit, stress resiliency services, financial planning services, career planning, civil and family court services. The branch could also include a cultural affairs branch to build and restore and maintain African American cultural historical sites, creative centers, public displays, and monuments. And that recommendation comes from some of the experts that gave expert testimony at our December hearing of last year. This cultural affairs branch could also advocate for the removal of racist relics, support knowledge production and archival research with community archives and repositories, support legacy families, and to provide support for African Americans in the entertainment industry, including identifying and removing barriers to advancement into leadership and decision-making positions in the arts, entertainment, and sports industries. Next slide, please. Again, this bureau could also include a cultural affairs office that would also do the following: allocate state funding. And this is, well, can I say this is directly from the DOJ? No. Okay, well, I don't even think it is. But this recommending the cultural office may be designated to allocate state funding for the above duties, as well as supporting descendants of enslaved people for the following: business licenses, recreation of cultural hubs, leisure sites, including coastal sites, news publications, arts, film, radio, TV, art, podcasting, and lifestyle activities, and supporting parity amongst sports played by white and African American Californians. Also, the Bureau could include a legal affairs office to coordinate a range of free legal services, including criminal defense attorneys for criminal trials and parole hearings, free arbitration and mediation services, and to advocate for civil and criminal justice reforms. Next slide, please. The Bureau could also potentially include a division of medical services for public and environmental health, a business affairs office to provide ongoing education related to entrepreneurialism, to provide business grants and business licenses, state funding to support the recreation of cultural hubs and leisure sites, news publications, arts and lifestyle activities, and to establish public-private reparative justice-oriented partnerships with interested corporations. 2 new agency functions that the task force could propose to increase efficiency and effectiveness of this proposed bureau are establishing a data research and collection branch to identify and analyze trends in past, current, and future harms, and then also a community support branch to improve accessibility, transparency, and public trust with the California Reparations Claims Program. So that concludes the recommendations as it relates to the establishment of a California Freedmen's Bureau. And to summarize, this bureau would be essentially a permanent resource hub for the community of eligibility. It will be the institution that would be responsible for dispensing and adjudicating reparations claims as well. It would operate similar to the Bureau of Indian Affairs on a federal level, and even the Office of Immigrant Affairs in certain federal, state, and localities as well. Next slide, please. So the next set of recommendations, the last set of recommendations, relates to Chapter 9, Control over Creative, Cultural, and Intellectual Life. Next slide. And again, these sets of recommendations are organized around the different forms of reparations under international law. First, again, starting with satisfaction, which gets at more symbolic forms of reparations. So the task force may consider recommending the state legislature sponsor a resolution that would issue a formal apology on behalf of the state of California for its role in discrimination and exclusion of descendants in the field of creativity, culture, and intellectual life. So there's all sorts of apologies that the state of California hasn't necessarily atoned for, or atrocities that the state of California hasn't atoned for. And I already discussed that in the field of enslavement. But in the field of cultural, intellectual, and creative life, the California has yet to atone for the endorsement of minstrel shows openly allowing segregation and discrimination against descendant musicians, workers, and artists. They have yet to apologize for addressing restrictive zoning ordinances, licensing laws, fire safety codes, and anti-nuisance laws that adversely affected descendants. California has yet to apologize for state censorship of cinematic depictions of discrimination and Black people integrating into white society. They have yet to apologize for targeting African-American hip-hop artists and targeting harassment of African-American owned businesses that provided leisure opportunities to Black Californians. The state of California has yet to apologize for the implementation of anti-cruising and anti-gathering laws and curfews that adversely affected the descendant community. This subpart might include a legal resolution condemning anti-cruising, anti-gathering, and curfew laws in recognition of anti-Black history. And again, these are data graphics that come from our report. The minstrel performance became a cross-generational racial parody and stereotype made for white amusement. The performance of minstrelsy relied on racist stereotypes that dehumanized African Americans. This dehumanizing allowed white Americans to secure their own positive identity. And then as a reminder, the Hollywood film industry was responsible for popularizing white supremacist movies like The Birth of a Nation. During the first half of the 1900s, the film was a main factor behind the revival of the Ku Klux Klan or the KKK in the 1900s. Next slide. So the next form or set of recommendations for reparations for Chapter 9 relates to restitution. Now this is a picture from Chapter 9. Little Richard, as we all know, protesting record companies over royalties. Little Richard sold the rights to the song Tutti Frutti for a reported $50 and received half a cent for each record sold. He said, "I was a dumb Black kid and my mama had 12 kids and my daddy was dead." Little Richard reportedly said, "I wanted to help them, so I took whatever was offered." And that was in 1984. So in terms of potential recommendations, the task force may consider recommending proposals to provide state funding to descendants to address disparity in compensation. One, among athletes, disparity in compensation derives from a history of discrimination against descendant athletes. The task force can also recommend proposals to provide funding to the proposed California Freedmen's Bill, specifically for creative, cultural, and intellectual life to address the disruption of descendant cultural centers in the name of redevelopment, and to address the history of censorship of descendant-produced media and arts. Also, we can recommend the requirement of public disclosure of compensation and benefits for artists across all media industries in California to address the inequities and disparity that descendant artists and descendant media executives face in recruitment, compensation, and promotion. Last slide, second to last slide. And then lastly, in terms of guarantees of non-repetition, the Reparations Task Force may consider proposals to identify and remove all Confederate monuments, plaques, and state markers and memorials that memorialize and preserve Confederate culture, similar to the denazification of Germany after World War II, to address the history of state-sponsored monuments on state property, glorifying slavery and white supremacy. In terms of guarantees of non-repetition, we can also recommend the repeal or amending of Proposition 209 to address systemic discrimination faced by descendant artists and descendant culture and the general barriers imposed by Proposition 209, which continue to have limiting effects to descendants. And then lastly, the task force can recommend requiring a racial impact assessment for all future legislation to ensure that there is a long-term and ongoing commitment to remedying the harms caused by the history and trauma of state-sponsored discrimination against descendants across all sectors, including art and culture. And the picture again is from our interim report. It says the picture is from 1868. and it is entitled "This is a White Man's Government." So I thought it was important to put that in the guarantees of non-repetition section to ensure that our recommendations are transformative in the sense that what we see depicted in terms of this Black man being subjugated is no longer our reality for the future. Next slide. And so, again, thank you to September, December 2021 personal and expert witnesses for their contributions. And also, again, special thanks to Vince Gazawi, Jeremy Payne, and Newton Knowles for your support and assistance. Okay, any questions, comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of Task Force. Might not we consider that in the early presentation of the harms that's done, we should not sanitize the legacy of Peter Burnett, the first governor of the state. Peter Burnett was an arch racist, born in Nashville, Tennessee, led the first wagon train in 1843. And the stipulation for that wagon train was that no mulattoes or blacks would be permitted to be in the wagon train. The only condition for them being to make an exception was they had to be enslaved. And when the man got up to the Oregon Territory, he settled that little town, that hamlet, Germantown. What was his first act of business? Not how a road should be built or how a cabin should be built, but it was the Peter Burnett flogging law that said any black or mulatto who would be caught in that town would be beaten every 6 months until they left town. He didn't leave his craziness up in the Oregon Territory. And by the way, that law stayed on the books of Oregon until 1926. But when he got down to California in 1848, got involved in politics up there at Sacramento, and emerged to be the first governor of the state. And during his early time in office, he tried to get through the assembly a bill that no blacks and mulattoes would be permitted to settle in California. And he was so slick, like Donald Trump, that he got on the Supreme Court after he left office. And there was the civil rights case of 1857 involving a young man, 19 years old, named R.C. Lee, who came to California. His enslaver, Charles Stovall, came to California to build a school and to have some respite so that his health could be attended to. The story goes that they tried to send him back to Mississippi. But thanks to those Broderick and Baker families who were abolitionists, they fought Stovall's attempt. And that case was settled in 1858. And those blacks in San Francisco met in First AME Zion Church on April the 13th. Thanks that a sailor named Medley heard about their meeting and how blacks couldn't serve on juries in San Francisco. Couldn't get housing, couldn't get jobs, no school. So what happened? Governor up in British Columbia heard about their plight and sent word that if they got on Negler's ship, the Commodore, they could have all the land they needed up on Victoria Island. That was the out-migration of blacks from San Francisco in 1858, because it all started with the first governor, Peter Burnett, and his pictures in that state capitol. His legacy lingers. So I think we should have an abbreviated statement about how this first governor set the stage, created the climate for the exclusion of black folk. That's a matter of historical record, and I don't think that we should do this report without it being included, so that the truth and the whole truth will be told about how these harms began through the leadership of this state.
Agreed. Thank you. We'll take that back to the committee so that we can move the agenda along. We are behind. If there aren't any objections to anything that was presented, I think we need to move forward. Oh, sorry. Member Montgomery Stubb, you're recognized.
Chairman, I'll just be really quick. I also want to thank you for categorizing the type of reparations as well in your report. I want to say something about the California Freedmen's Bureau, and it kind of ties into Member Tamaki's earlier report around education. I just really, I know it takes time to set up bureaus and agencies, but the current institutions that we have, just like the trauma that we have as Black folks, they're just inherently racist institutions. And we just have, it takes a lot of time to weed that out. So just kind of starting with a new agency and bureau with this particular purpose is just, I think, something that I would like the task force members to take note of. Thank you.
Girls, you're recognized.
Thank you. And really, this is just for clarifying questions, but that don't need to be answered in full at this point. And this is related to the Freedmen's Bureau. In terms of the civic engagement branch, it notes that it would include supporting civic engagement among African American youth. And I was just wanting to see if we might extend that to youth and adults, because the intergenerational community organizing can be very powerful. And then the Freedmen Education Branch to offer free education. And I just, if we could clarify what level of education, are we talking junior college, or private elementary, middle and high schools? And then lastly, there was the medical component of the Freedmen's Bureau. And I just was not clear, perhaps in the next iteration, is that a medical bureau that is going to be providing technical support to something like wellness centers? Or is that, so it's not clear, because if it's a Freedmen's Bureau, it's going to be located in one place in the state, I would imagine, unless there are branch offices. So if it's one place in the state, being able to address medical concerns of local communities might be challenging.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, great. Thank you so much again. Now we will move forward to the next item on the agenda, which is going to be led by members Montgomery Stepp and Senator Bradford, Advisory Committee on Chapter 4, Political Disenfranchisement.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll just wait a few seconds for it to come up on the screen here. It's on that screen, just not online. And I think this will be fairly brief. I'm going to start off with this on behalf of the Political Disenfranchisement Advisory Committee, and also again want to thank the DOJ for its collaborative work on putting policy recommendations together, going back and forth with our offices, our staff members, and ourselves. So thank you. I also want to pretext this conversation with the recognition that these recommendations are, of course, a starting point for where we will go, and we're going to continue our in-depth conversations. Billie Holiday saying, "Them that's got shall have, and them that's not shall lose." So we're diving deep into the atrocities and specific roles that California played in producing generations of harm, what descendants of enslaved people have lost and continue to lose daily. Next slide, please. So slide 2 is a formal apology on behalf of the state of California for its role in political disenfranchisement of descendants. So first, we know that this is a natural part of fulfilling the definition of reparations. Still, California must provide a formal public apology for the political disenfranchisement of descendants. Apologies do tend to have a performative nature if there is no further action to repair harm, but they can serve as a consistent reflection of values. And of course, we've been talking about many recommendations to pair with apologies. If the state considers itself progressive in its values, the descendants of enslaved people deserve an apology that includes an expression of remorse, acknowledgement of harm, accepting responsibility, an effort of repair, and commitment to systemic change. In forming the apology directly related to political disenfranchisement, the state could address the following, but is not limited to addressing these things. California's ban on Black people from testifying against a white person in court. California opposing the 14th and 15th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. California's history of political disenfranchisement through the use of racial barriers to voting. The construction of monuments, plaques, state markers, and memorials preserving Confederate culture, glorifying slavery and white supremacy. We definitely see a lot of overlap in our presentations on that. And very significantly, California's role in disrupting the Black Panther Party and its founders through law enforcement overreach. Next slide. So we would require district-based voting and independent redistricting commissions. So even with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, equality in voting is still at risk and must be addressed in order to protect the strength of the African-American voting bloc from political gerrymandering, which correlates into racial gerrymandering. It's imperative to protect redistricting in the state of California, especially considering that there is no consistent true independence in the redistricting commissions. We have recently experienced this. The recent example of events out of Los Angeles, conversations about redistricting maps revealed a malicious attempt to gerrymander certain districts to dilute the Black vote. In LA, council members can revise redistricting maps, which threatens representation and further presents political disenfranchisement. So one way we can address these instances is to increase state enforcement of claims of voter dilution. So we know that the conversation in LA we all heard it, but there are other conversations that go on that we don't necessarily hear that are similar nature. And so while we could recommend eliminating those acts, we also recommend increasing voting and census education for the community of eligibility who cannot be erased from the political process. Next slide, please. We also recommend passing legislation to support education and civic engagement activities related to voting. Policy recommendations for education and civic engagement must be intentional. And a big part of that must include civic engagement and engagement for our young people, our youth. To address any barriers in civic activities, the legislature could amend education and election codes to integrate academic and political participation in elections. We could also recommend implementing aspects of previously introduced AB 2576, which sought to include programs that allowed students to serve as election workers. Representation is severely lacking in political office throughout the state. For more African American people to run for office, we would recommend funding activities and organizations that increase civic engagement and train or support potential candidates who are descendants of enslaved people. Mail-in ballots are an excellent stride in establishing equity, but to increase access to the polls, we would recommend making Election Day a paid state holiday and providing free public transportation on this day. The pairing of those recommendations would increase access for working registered voters. Coming up more frequently, accusations of voter fraud have come into the conversation about increasing access to voting. As a result, voter registration has become increasingly difficult for people who may not be able to afford identification documents or those who may have low access to DMV services in rural areas. And to address this, we could create grant funding and stipends for descendants of enslaved people to meet voter registration requirements. And now I'll pass it to Senator Bradford. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just add under the education component that under AB 2576 that wasn't passed, that would have provided $15 million for community outreach and education programs, which the councilwoman mentioned, but some folks had asked what was 2576. So, and aspects of that should be included. And I would also add that we've seen where in more affluent communities, young folks are not only encouraged to work on campaigns, either around candidates or issues, but they get extra credit for it. And very rarely do you see that in our community. So I'm now charged with dealing with changing the slide of increased jury participation by those who are formerly incarcerated. I will wait for that to be placed up. There we have it. Existing law allows people with previous felony convictions to be called to serve on juries as long as they are not on parole or probation and they are not registered felony sex offender. I think this is key in increasing the jury pool of our peers, because many times we find and see African Americans being convicted of crimes that they did not commit, only due to the fact that they had no one in that jury pool that was sympathetic to them or understood who they were and always found them to be guilty. Just the reverse of that was the Emmett Till situation by all-white jury that exonerated those individuals who were involved in that brutal murder of Emmett Till. So diversifying and allowing those individuals who have served time to participate in jury pools is critical. Proposed legal guidance and affirmative code amendments that a prior felony conviction cannot be used as a sole basis for disqualifying an individual from being a potential juror. And also in looking in this area, what I learned firsthand is that of all the restrictions that are placed on individuals who are on parole or probation, don't associate with criminal, known criminal activity, or individuals don't use drugs, don't drink, don't carry a gun. They adhere to that more so than any other, than the fact that don't vote. That's the one they follow 100% of the time, most of the time. Of all the restrictions that are placed on someone on parole, the fact that you can't vote, that's the only one they really adhere to. They will carry a gun. They will, so I think we have to change that whole perception about voting and understanding how important it is, because again, even our ones who have done their time, they still refuse to go out and vote after being released off of probation or parole. Require legislative policy committees to conduct, this is our next one, require legislative policy committees to conduct racial impact analysis of all proposed legislation, budgets, and regulations. Just an assessment should be in writing and include findings of the impact of the proposed legislation, the budgets, and the regulations that might have an impact on these descendants. Next slide. Increase the efforts to restore the voting rights of formerly incarcerated. Proposition 17 was approved in November of 2020 and amended the California Constitution to permit people on parole for felony convictions to vote in California, and this is critically important. And to continue public education campaigns, as stated, that's what 25, AB, I'm sorry, I'm getting the number there, but that bill would have allowed some more of that outreach and education campaigns, and require the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to provide returning citizens with voter registration information. As stated many times, they're left and released with no information from even housing, knowing how to get a personal ID, and registering to vote should be part of those tools that you provide individuals once they're released. So hopefully those are some of the things that we decided or brought forth as recommendations to work on or suggest through the task force. So that concludes my presentation.
Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the task force. I would like to suggest that we would consider including Marian Wright Elderman's Freedom School template as a means of providing civic engagement opportunities for young people, and that we can also integrate that into our educational report. Many of you possibly are aware of this excellent model that evolved out of the state of Mississippi, 1964, when students were in the Mississippi Delta trying to enfranchise Black people. They discovered that they didn't know how to read nor write. And that's when the freedom schools began. And it was around the same time that Swarner, Goodman, and Cheney were murdered because they were part of that movement. And prior to that, the first martyr was Reverend George Washington Lee, who on May the 7th, 1955, was on his way home. And members of the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council took shotguns and shot his jaw off. The car ran into Mrs. Blyer's porch, tore it up. He staggered out of the car. They tried to rush him to the hospital in a taxi, and he died on the way. His funeral was the first open casket funeral, not Emmett Till's. That's where Mrs. Till got the idea from. And in Belzoni, Mississippi, that funeral was held, and over 2,000 people attended. So many were there that they had to have the funeral outside of the church there in Belzoni. And Reverend Lee was president of the Belzoni, Mississippi branch of the National Association for the Advancement for Colored People. It was all about voting and Black folks becoming enfranchised. And he lost his life as the first martyr, and not Swarner, Goodman, and Cheney, though they did pray the supreme sacrifice too.
Thank you so much, Vice Chair Brown, for your comments. Are there any other comments or questions for the advisory committee on their presentation? Well, thank you all so much. Let's clap it up for Member Montgomery Stepp and Senator Bradford. This is great. Absolutely excellent. So we'll now turn to the next item on the agenda. I did want to recognize Oscar Grant Sr. was here. He had to step out right now. As folks know, Oscar Grant III was a 22-year-old African-American man who was killed in the early morning hours of New Year's Day, 2009, by BART police officer Joannis Mercilli in Oakland, California. So to the point of, we were just talking about extrajudicial murder of African-American men in particular in the South, and how we're still dealing with that today in the 21st century. So thank you, Oscar Grant Sr., for attending. So now we'll turn to the next item on the agenda, which is going to be led by Vice Chair Brown and Member Tamaki. Advisory committees on Chapters 6 and 12, health harms, and education. Or
Yes.
okay.
Well, it's actually two presentations, but with your permission, Chair Moore, let me know when I could proceed. So the first is mental and physical harm and neglect, health harms, and includes environmental harms. And with Pastor Brown's consent, I will drive the presentation and invite him to chime in and make comments anywhere along the way. First of all, I want to acknowledge the Department of Justice legal team that's helped put this presentation together, and without whose help would not be possible in terms of the deep research that was done. And so at the table are Daniel Elliott, thank you very much, and Robin Goldfaden. But I also want to acknowledge Delbert Tran and Mina Visvanathan, as well as Christine Chuang for helping us in these two complex sections. I think these all go into the category broadly of stopping the harm, guarantees of non-repetition. It's a reflection basically how deeply anti-Black bias has infected the health systems and education systems. And so let me, with that, begin with first slide, please. So this first issue is anti-Black discrimination and implicit bias in healthcare has led to severe negative disparities in health outcomes for Black Americans, which are cited in the interim report. And these are merely examples. Black maternal death rate has been 3.3 times the white rate, accounting to 43% of the national total. Between 2014 and 2016, Black women in California were 6 times more likely to die within a year of pregnancy than white women. Black people have led in 13 to 15 categories of the leading causes of death, and Black life expectancy has 5 to 7 fewer years than white life expectancy. Next slide, please. So the proposal is to fund the Health Equity and Racial Justice Fund within California Department of Public Health, Office of Health Equity, to provide grants directly to community-based organizations, including clinics, to identify and address the most pressing healthcare issues. And Oakland has had a number of these, including these CBO clinics on the ground in diverse communities with, I think, really great results because they are on the ground. Expand healthcare coverage for Black Californians or descendants of enslaved people who lack coverage, or alternatively endorse previously introduced Assembly Bill 1400, providing comprehensive universal single-payer health care coverage for all residents. That has not been successful up to now, and that's an area that may be part of the solution. Close the gaps in access to primary and specialty care for those covered under Medi-Cal, subject to denial by providers due to low reimbursement rates. So specialty care are things like heart disease, diabetes care, and neurosurgery, this kind of thing that requires high degree of expertise, in which if you're a Medi-Cal recipient, it's hard to get that kind of care. Next slide, please. Disparities persist in Black health outcomes as a result of historical inequality, discriminatory health policy, racial discrimination, including unconscious implicit bias that we've talked about. African Americans receive fewer procedures and poor quality medical care across every type of diagnostic and treatment intervention than white Americans, suffer higher rates of morbidity and mortality from than white Americans in almost all health outcomes, and this inequality only increases with age. Moreover, in order to effectively address discrimination in healthcare, standardized data collection is critical to understand the disparities that exist in the system. So a number of task force members have talked about and highlighted the need for data, but without data, you can't make a case as to where the needs are and what's not, being met in terms of holes that need to be filled in the system. And so the collection of data, and not just in healthcare and education, in criminal justice, all of these areas becomes really crucial. Next slide, please. So adding evidence-based anti-bias training is part of the solution, and an assessment based on such a training to the graduation requirements for all medical schools and all healthcare provider programs, including mental and behavioral health in California receiving state funding. So in order to address this implicit bias question, that training is necessary. Mandate an annual study of California healthcare laws and policies to evaluate their effect on Black Californians and publish findings and recommendations to the legislature, and create statewide standards for data collection and reporting of demographic and social needs to assess the, quote, individual, cultural, linguistic, and health-related social needs of patients to address health disparities and improve health care and quality and outcomes. Next slide, please. Here's another issue. Black birthing Californians are substantially more likely than white birthing people to suffer severe health complications during pregnancy, give birth prematurely, lose their babies, die in childbirth, accounting for more than 20% of pregnancy-related deaths, despite being only 5% of the birthing population. The proposal, next slide, please. Require California to adequately support doula services to provide physical and emotional support during pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum period, covered as a Medi-Cal preventative service starting in 2023, by requiring the California Department of Healthcare Services to take additional steps to implement doula care services. Next slide, please. Another issue, a growing body of research has begun to document the individual and multi-generational impact of racism on health, and numerous states and municipalities across the country have declared racism as a public health crisis. Proposal, fund the study of the intergenerational impact of racism and formulate recommendations for enhanced medical health care, including educating medical health care workers. I think this is one of the things Member Cheryl Grills has really been pushing for. Next slide, please. Issue, segregation, redlining, and unequal distribution of the benefits of public infrastructure have resulted in Black Californians having unequal access to affordable, healthy food, and poor quality housing with less access to green spaces, playgrounds, and parks. So that's part of the environmental presentation too, and other speakers have talked about the lack of accessibility to nutritious, healthy food and green space. Next slide, please. Proposal is to require grocery store closure guidelines and advance closing notice in food deserts, facilitate innovative farmers markets initiatives and or mobile vendors, that this was mentioned before, promoting urban agriculture through various tax credits and mixed-use zoning ordinances. Lisa Holder mentioned this, and distribute grants to community-based organizations within neighborhoods that have been redlined to address environmental and infrastructure inequity. And this is one of the things that the DOJ team has shined a light on, that to identify areas of need that might be viewed as race neutral in an era where the constitutionality of this has been challenged, to direct services based upon a history of harm, and one way is redlining. Issue, while research has, this is next slide, please, sorry. Okay.
There's, Don, there's an issue with the city's control room downstairs. We're trying to work out, so.
Just give me the word when there's a problem and I will stop. I think we're in line now, or there isn't. What I could do is just proceed and explain as we go along, and recognizing that it's not up there. So The issue here is while research has demonstrated the importance of Black medical and mental health providers in delivering healthcare services to underserved Black patients, Black Californians make up 6% of the state's population, as you know, but only 3% of doctors in California are Black. and there are substantial barriers remain for Black students to enter the medical and mental health behavioral healthcare professions. Okay, so the next slide would be, okay, issue, the unmet mental health needs are higher among Black Californians as compared with white Californians and across racial groups. The highest percentage of serious psychological distress and attempted suicide was found among Black Californians. Member Grills has highlighted this point in particular. California Medical Board data from 2003 to 2013 revealed that Black physicians were more likely than white physicians to be the subject of complaint investigations, but these investigations were not more likely to result in disciplinary action, which may indicate racial bias. So the proposal, next slide, please. Okay. Fully fund and expand the UC programs in medical education, it's called UC Prime, for African, Black, and Caribbean communities to all UC medical campuses. And it's been a successful model of both recruiting and mentoring Black medical students, while also increasing the number of Black medical professionals dedicated to serving predominantly Black communities. The program provides specialized coursework, structured clinical experiences, advanced independent study, and mentoring programs for Black communities. Next slide, please. Proposal is to create and fund equivalents to the UC Prime for psychologists, licensed counselors, and licensed therapists. So mirror that program for behavioral psychologists, counselors, and therapists. Permanently fund the California Medical Scholars Pilot Program and create and fund equivalent pathway programs for students in the Cal State University and University of California UC systems. This program connects community college students to medical schools, clinics, and practitioners to promote pathways for underrepresented college students to enter medicine, to provide encouragement and a way forward that they could actually enter these professions, and provides mentorship by practitioners, academic advising, enhanced curriculum, and priority enrollment to that student when the student applies to that particular medical school. It's kind of a pathway directly into both training and the profession. Next slide, please. Proposal: fund or expand similar pathway programs for high school students and or other medical professions such as nurses, physician assistants, and nurse practitioners. This is certainly one way to expand the number of medical staff serving underserved communities, is to emphasize not just the doctors, but also very highly skilled medical people, such as physician assistants, nurse practitioners, and so on. And to prevent racially biased disciplinary practices by the medical board, require the Medical Board of California to undergo implicit bias training, conduct an annual review by an independent party of the board's records to determine racial bias in disciplinary proceedings, and the implementation of remedial measures if bias is found. In other words, if there's a finding of bias, what is the fix for that, and what is the implementation, and that should proceed. And so that concludes the slides, but I wanted to call upon Deputy Attorney Generals Goldfaden and Elliott if they have any comments or observations that you would like to weigh in on. Okay. I wanted just to open up that invitation, and then turning to Pastor Brown and asking if you have any comments you'd like to add.
Thank you very much, Brother Don and members of the task force. Only thing I would like to add is that in addition to that excellent work that you have reported on, we need to sharpen a little bit more what we need to do to test for and remove this toxicity that's in communities where African Americans live. That goes for public housing and also for the environment. Someone earlier mentioned Bayview Hunters Point, which is ground zero for environmental injustice. Additionally, there is no comprehensive mental health clinic for the whole family in Bayview Hunters Point. That happens in other points in other areas of the state. We're just underserved, and we need to play catch up. But Benjamin Mays said he or she who is behind in the race of life will stay behind, or had better run faster in order to catch up. And we need to hit the ground running to deal with these health issues, because if we don't, it'll be a mute issue. If we're dead as a duck and not around, we won't be able to take care of celebrating culture, to learn, to make some money, or do anything. The health is very basic. And we also need to deal with not just the food deserts, but the food swamps. There are a lot of food swamps in these Black communities.
To add to this point, I wonder if I can continue on with the environmental health part, because dovetails quite nicely with Pastor Brown's wise comments. So if you could pull that up. Okay. Next slide, please. So the issue is those red line communities, as established by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the maps correlate, this is unsurprising, the maps correlate redlining maps with the infrastructure inequality in housing segregation today. Neighborhoods rated A as best by the redlining maps have twice as many trees as those rated D for the worst. Without trees, communities suffer from increased health and environmental hazards. Trees are essential in combating some of the deadliest harms of climate change by improving health air quality and reducing the effects of heat islands, which are urban areas that are significantly warmer than surrounding areas due to the concentration of buildings, roads, and structures that absorb solar radiation and transform and emit it as heat. Next slide, please. Proposal is to amend Senate Bill 1000 to require local governments to identify redlined communities within their jurisdiction and make plans to increase tree canopy coverage and access to green space to limit pollution exposure, ameliorate heat island effects, and improve air quality. Next slide, please. Issue is redline communities lack the public infrastructure to adapt to the gravest climate change risks, and African Americans bear some of the greatest risks from climate change, including increased asthma diagnoses, premature mortality from extreme heat, or pollution exposure. Obviously, I'm only listing a few things as, mere examples. Next slide, please. The proposal would be to utilize existing programming and funding from the California Strategic Growth Council to provide economic support to redline communities that lack the public infrastructure to adapt to the greatest climate change risks by supporting local resiliency hubs to facilitate communication, distribute aid, and become more self-sustaining during climate emergencies, which we know will happen, and provide grants to local redline communities to improve infrastructure, climate resiliency, and other health harms associated with the legacy of redlining. Next slide, please. Retrofit public buildings to serve as client resiliency hubs to respond to climate disasters by providing clean water, food distribution, high-speed internet, electricity, heat or air conditioning, and so on. And develop accessible warning alert systems and climate shelters for unhoused residents. Ensure investments in lowering greenhouse gas emissions and climate change projects that do not cause displacement by increasing property values and spurring cycles of gentrification. So as we improve the infrastructure, certainly one peril is that you also increase the land valuation and then or the building valuation, and you actually increase gentrification at the same time. So we'd want to be mindful of that. Turning the page to next slide. Issue, this was mentioned by other speakers, lead pollution from industrial sites, paint, gasoline exhaust, and pipes that deliver drinking water to homes is disproportionately high in Black communities that were segregated through redlining. In 2019, the New York Times reported that as many as 1,000 community water systems in California may be at high risk of failing to deliver potable water, with a disproportionate number located in low-income areas. A UCLA report in 2021 identified 29 failing water systems in Los Angeles County, and these systems largely service communities of color. Next slide, please. Proposal is to fund lead service line replacement on privately owned property to remove lead in drinking water and ban partial lead service line replacement, which studies show indicates to actually greater health risks. Allocate 40% of the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funds received by the state for full lead service line replacement to go directly to disadvantaged or low-income communities and Black communities that were formerly redlined. Next slide, please. This is a familiar theme of the task force. From the 1950s to the 70s, highway construction targeted neighborhoods and valuable inner city land that tended to be overwhelmingly poor and Black. These highways destroyed Black communities or otherwise suffocated their economic vitality by cutting off access to the rest of the city and caused Black communities to be disproportionately located near highways and exposed to on-road carcinogenic pollution, nitrogen oxide emitted from vehicles contributing to asthma and other respiratory ailments, and higher than average concentrations of PM 2.5 fine particulate matter from all sources, including industry, diesel trucks, and construction. Next slide, please. Proposal, reduce the pollution burden of Black communities by ending highway expansion in areas with high levels of pollution already. And that's the last of that slide. I want to turn to Attorney Generals Goldfaden and Elliott, if you have any further comments to add.
Yes, I just wanted to add one thing, that responding to environmental justice harms involves immense community organizing, and there's already a lot of organizations in California that are doing an excellent job. And some of these proposals were inspired by the California Environmental Justice Alliance, which has initiatives such as green zones, which are community-based solutions that reconfigure unhealthy land use patterns into neighborhoods that are overwhelmed by pollution. So I think there's a lot of resources out there that the task force can and should be inspired by that are already doing excellent work.
I trust that when we move to the next iteration of this section that we'll be drawing on those resources. So we're, as Pastor Brown said, we're not reinventing the wheel, and we're synthesizing the latest and most effective strategies.
Absolutely. And we've already been working with the environmental justice attorneys and the DOJ to address this issue, but they will absolutely be incorporated moving forward as well.
Terrific. Pastor Brown, defer to you. Do you have any comments or? I think that concludes our presentation.
Other questions, comments, major objections? Hearing none. Oh, sorry, Senator Bradford, you're recognized.
And I appreciate the presentation. I would only add that as we move to this environmental justice and green economy, that we make sure people that look like us work in this space, because we're not there. And our communities are being impacted the most, but we very rarely ever get any of these jobs. So that should be part of the work as well. And where I chaired utilities, and where I saw where low income, especially African American folks, were being sold solar, they didn't need it on their homes. What they needed was insulation. What they needed was to seal up the unit, but they were being sold on solar and not even telling them to buy it. They were telling them to lease it, where these companies got the tax breaks and tax credits. So they're being exploited even when you come into our neighborhood. So we need to be conscious and have a mindset and look for that as well moving forward.
Thank you. Should we turn to the education presentation? Oh, sorry.
Rose, you're recognized.
Thank you. If this wasn't so critical, I would just leave it for another day. But I just wanted to uplift two things that you were sharing in your report. And this is specific to mental health. You made mention about suicide rates. And I just want to draw two things to the task force's attention. One, and that should raise the bar for how we attend to it. The issue of suicide among children has, of course, the country tracks that. While suicide rates have been on the decline for most children, it has been on the increase for Black children, and especially for children between 5 and 11 years of age. And the greatest increase has been among Black boys. So we've got a crisis here that really requires some attention. And then in terms of Black adults, if you saw the news this morning, people were talking about Ellen DeGeneres' DJ Twix, yeah. And so in passing, they noted that suicide rates were on the rise, especially for Black males, at a rate of around 53%, which is striking, and I need to double check that. But so I just want to make sure we uplift that issue. Secondly, there was mention about increasing the pipeline of Black physicians and psychologists and social workers. I just want to point out that Black physicians are catching absolute hell out there in terms of racial discrimination, racial stress, and racial trauma, and that we may need to add in some recommendations to support them. They are under tremendous stress. I just met with about 75 or so Black physicians in the Northern California area a few months ago, and it was harsh to try to understand and provide tools for them to address what they're dealing with, from medical school to residency to medical practice. They're catching hell at every single step.
I wonder if you could help us source data information on both subjects, actually. When governments declare racism as a public health emergency, really what you're drilling down is what that means. Well, that translates into skyrocketing Black suicide among youth. And certainly with respect to the issue of what Black students who are seeking, to enter the medical profession, and what those who are in the profession are undergoing, it'd be great to benefit from whatever studies that you have access to.
I can send them to you.
That'd be great. Thank you.
But I say this, and once we get the training, we've done our residency, and particularly get into these health departments, Black health professionals are not getting fairness and justice. I know I can speak with great authority regarding San Francisco County. So all of these counties need to be included in this harm. Black professionals, whether nurses, psychiatrists, or psychologists, the health departments are not being inclusive and just, even when it comes to disciplinary actions.
Okay, thank you. We're turning to the Education Advisory Committee, of both which Pastor Brown and I serve on, and turning the first page. The issue that in recent decades California has passed and the Supreme Court has upheld laws that stopped school desegregation, resulting in California as of 2020 being among the top 10 most segregated states for Black students. 64% of Black students and 64% of Black students attend hyper-segregated, low-resourced schools. The proposal is to follow Berkeley as one model, permitting students to transfer to public schools within their district or between neighboring districts, if doing so would improve racial integration and other diversity measurements such as socioeconomic status diversity. Turning the page. Another issue, funding is critical to closing the opportunity gap. It's, I think, common sense really and obvious, yet Black students in California disproportionately attend under-resourced schools in highly segregated neighborhoods. The existing local control funding formula, LCCF, does not concentrate funding on Black students who for decades have experienced the greatest disparities, and the LCCF does not require schools to ensure that funds are used directly to support such high needs students. The proposal is to direct substantial additional funding to schools with students experiencing the greatest educational disparities, requiring that funds should be used or must be used to address academic needs directly and monitored to ensure that such funding is deployed in the required manner. I think in one way or the other, each of the task force members have called on the need for targeted, specialized, focus on the funding. And Member Stepp and Montgomery Stepp and others have specifically called upon that this should be focused and direct. Turning the page. Issue, the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically impacted education, exacerbating racial disparities that existed before the pandemic. So whatever the problems were before the pandemic has gotten worse, of course, with it. And it's caused multi-month learning losses in math and reading with disproportionate impact for low-income students of color, including a widening academic gap for Black students. Mental health crises for young children and teens, compounding the need for mental health services, particularly among Black and Latinx students. And research shows that Black students are less likely to attend schools with adequate counseling staff or access to mental health services, and teacher and educational staff shortages. So the pandemic itself has created a disruption in the teaching profession, with many leaving the profession. Turning the page. Proposal is to provide additional COVID-19 relief grants for local educational agencies with a requirement to focus on reducing racial disparities and mitigating the pandemic's harmful impact on Black students, ensure sufficiently long-term funding to support measures identified as necessary to close the pandemic exacerbated educational opportunity gap, including expanded day and full year instruction and enrichment for elementary students, including summer school, tutoring and other educational intervention, including learning acceleration, counseling and mental health services, and a proposal relating to science, technology, engineering, art, and math disparities in education is in progress. We're taking a look at that now and cross-referencing that to high-quality career and technical education. That was mentioned also by other task force members to get into non-college, but yet high-paying training and professions. Turning the page, next slide. Issue studies establish the importance of students having at least one teacher who looks like them. Black students comprise 5.1% of California students, but Black adults comprise just 3.9% of the state's teachers, with Black men only 1% of teachers in California. Proposal: adopt mandatory curriculum for teacher credentialing and trainings that include culturally responsive teaching methods, identify and support teachers who give culturally nurturing instruction, and adopt new methods and models to improve teacher habits in the classroom, and develop proactive strategies to recruit African American K through 12 teachers. Next slide, please. Issue, this is something that we've addressed repeatedly: erasure of Black history and dehumanization of African Americans in textbooks contribute to a sense of alienation and being unimportant, invisible, and voiceless. Proposal to conduct a review of curriculum to assess whether it is inclusive, free of bias, and honors the contributions and experiences of all peoples, regardless of ethnicity, race, gender, or sexual orientation. Advance a timeline for ethnic studies classes in public and private high schools, and adopt a K through 12 Black studies curriculum. And again, I think that dovetails with our public education recommendations on curriculum as well. Next slide, please. This has been addressed by members Holder and Joan Sawyer. Issue: Black students are suspended at 3 times the rate of white students, are consistently punished more severely than white students for the same infractions, and lose nearly 4 times the number of days of instruction to suspensions and expulsions as compared to white students. Proposal: require an annual review of school disciplinary records to determine racial bias. Again, another example where data is necessary. Implementation of racially equitable disciplinary practices, mandated training on implicit bias and cultural competency, and positive behavioral interventions, and improve access to educational opportunities for all incarcerated people in both juvenile and adult correctional facilities. Next slide, please. Jumping to another subject, the cost of higher education has grown exponentially over the last several decades, disproportionately excluding Black Californians and reinforcing the ongoing history of discrimination in education. Since 2000, the percentage of Black enrollment has plummeted. Researchers identify the focus on standardized testing for admissions as one key cause of the decline. Studies dispute the efficacy of standardized test scores and as an accurate predictor of success in college and graduate school. And while that is a subject of dispute, that is to say, how effective the standardized test scores are in measuring potential and ability, there is a strong correlation between test scores and race and wealth. So the wealthier you tend to be, and the whiter you tend to be, the higher your test score tends to be. And Lisa Holder, member here, civil rights attorney, has been deeply involved in that litigation. And due to the concerns of discriminatory impact of these tests, the UC and CSU systems, and I believe member Holder was involved in this litigation that prompted this, have discontinued the use of standardized tests for undergraduate admissions. Next slide, please. Proposal: fund free education to the state's community colleges, Cal State universities, and universities of California for California residents who are descendants of enslaved people. Eliminate standardized testing as a requirement for admission into graduate programs. It's been done for undergraduate. The question is there a better way to measure potential and ability than standardized tests at the graduate level? and require the California Department of Education to conduct an annual review of racial bias in the design and administration of the California Assessment of Student Performance and Progress, a standardized test purporting to measuring proficiency. And that concludes the slides on education. And turning to the Deputy Attorney Generals, I wonder if you have any comments. If not, totally fine. I just want to open that invitation.
I don't have anything to add at this time, but I'm happy to take any questions and appreciate all the feedback that we've been given so far. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Brown, please.
Again, Madam Chair and members of the task force, I strongly recommend that we include a recommendation of the Freedom School being specifically included as a model and template for the education of these youngsters. And I hope that we will remember Koziel said some years ago in his book, Savage Inequality, that it's not a matter of our having no brains, focus, our interest in education. It's a matter of not being given opportunity and not making sure that the funding and resources are equal. That's it. And then the other thing I'll lift up, they're always talking about Chicago, crimes, killings, all that. Every time they mention it, in my presence, I remind them that William Golding wrote a classic book that later became a movie, Lord of the Flies. Lord of the Flies. Don't you remember those pristine, proper, erudite British boys who were on that plane in the South Pacific that crashed? These boys were privileged, but the longer that they stayed on that island by themselves, they devolved to becoming savages and worshiping the head of that pig. Black children and black folks in general will do all right. They will excel. Just give them the opportunity and the support services. We've always proven that. And a classic example is that Willie Lewis Brown Jr., the most celebrated quintessential politician in this state, who had the distinction of the longest tenure as Speaker of the Assembly. They even changed the rule to keep him from succeeding himself. But Willie Brown, after he left that segregated high school in Mineola, Texas, came to California to live with his uncle, Uncle Mitzi. Applied to go to Stanford University. Stanford turned him down, flat. No. He didn't let that break his spirit. He went on to San Francisco State, but he was admitted as a provisional student. Provisional student. Again, that didn't break his spirit. He went on. Focus, wax well. And the rest is history. Again, the footnote to this whole report and this whole process, major thing is, let's give black folks the opportunity and respect their humanity. They will prove how to make bricks without straw and how to make a way out of no way and still come forth as champions of scholarship, erudition, and great cultural celebrations.
Thank you. May I ask Deputy Attorney Generals Goldfaden and Elliott, to follow up with Pastor Brown in connection with the suggestion about freedom schools and Marion Wright Eagleman and the work she's done, and see if that, let's develop that as part of our proposal too. Thank you. That concludes our presentation.
Thank you so much again, everybody. Okay, so now we are a bit behind schedule, but we can still take a break. What's the pleasure of the task force? Do you want to work through or take a 10-minute break? We have one more substantive advisory committee, and the other is then a subpoena advisory committee presentation, and then something else. You want to take a break?
A brief break would be
Okay.
nice.
How many minutes?
10.
10 minutes? Okay, we'll take a 10-minute break.
Thank you.
So we'll resume at 3. Okay. We will now resume business. Before we do so, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson so that we can reestablish a quorum.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. I'll begin with Chair Moore.
Present.
Vice Chair Brown.
Present.
Member Bradford. Member Grills. Member Holder. Member Jones Sawyer. Member Lewis.
Present.
Member Montgomery Stepp.
Here.
And Member Tamaki.
Here.
Thank you. Madam Chair, there are 9 members on the task force. 5 are needed for a quorum. There are 9 members present. A quorum is reestablished.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. Now that a quorum has been reestablished, we'll return to business. Before we do so, I want to recognize Member Tamaki.
neglected to be able to acknowledge him as being supervising a lot of the work that has been done in education and in health. So thank you, Tony. Appreciate you. Thank you, Chair Moore.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And so the next item on the agenda is item number 22, presented by Member Lewis, Advisory Committee on the Wealth Gap.
Thank you, Chair Moore. So first, I want to start by thanking Drs. Casey Campbell and Thomas Kramer for their support throughout, and also the wonderful contributions by the remainder of the economics team, including Dr. William Spriggs and Kirsten Mullen and Dr. Sandy Darity. So, so earlier in our conversation, I mentioned very briefly some of the stakes of thinking about the racial wealth gap. So I'm going to say a bit more about that and then propose, a couple of items for our discussion for today. Hopefully I won't take up too much time so we can all, go home. All right. So the racial wealth gap is the product of discriminatory lending, employment, property, and commercial practices and policies against African-American individuals, communities, and enterprises, and critically, a privileging of practices and policies in those same areas towards white American individuals, communities, and enterprises, right? So we want to think about this as the racial wealth gap. So to be clear, the racial wealth gap is not the result of a failure of Black American productivity, industry, and entrepreneurism. I want to repeat it to be clear. The racial wealth gap is not the result of a failure of Black American productivity, industry, and entrepreneurism, but rather the consequence of their interruption and undermining due to outright racism or in specific service of further facilitating and securing the wealth of white Americans. As recent as 2021, the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances determined that white households hold 80% of overall wealth in the country. Conversely, Black Americans, broadly defined, hold only 3% of wealth. To put that in dollar terms, the median white family held $184,000 in wealth in 2019 compared to just $23,000 for the median Black family. And for further comparison, the median Hispanic family held $38,000 in wealth. Moreover, we should assume that these comparative figures become even starker once we disaggregate the data among the generalized Black population surveyed. Some economists note that the amount of wealth held by the typical Black household compared to the typical white family has remained almost the exact same ratio as it existed in the 1960s. In fact, any observable convergence or closing of the gap, an even slower path has been indicated over the last 150 years, with convergence stalling or this closing stalling after 1950. Even more damning, since the 1980s, the wealth gap has widened again as capital gains have predominantly benefited white households and income convergence has effectively stopped. So we're talking about since the 1980s, you have the altogether stopping of the closing of the gap. In fact, it has widened since the 1980s. So we are talking about a very recent phenomenon here. So it should be noted that while the median is a useful measure for calculating typical differences, and I've been using the median in a couple of instances here, so while it's useful for measuring and calculating typical differences in wealth between Blacks and whites, it leaves out significant outlier values, which would represent Black Americans impacted by significant economic disparities and whites who benefit from economic advantage. Therefore, the mean or average is the most appropriate measure for calculating the sum required to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And so I want us to just understand these differences and what we're talking about with the wealth gap. Or at least I should say, I am advocating for us thinking about the mean or the average disparity. So several key contributors to the racial wealth gap include, racial differences in home equity, financial assets, and income, all of which are necessary for economic security in their own right, and because they facilitate the accumulation of wealth over time. In addition to differences in asset values and composition, differences in the amount and type of debt held by households contribute to racial disparities in economic security. However, the racial wealth gap, right, as argued by many economists who advocate for reparations, including Darity and Mullen and many of the other individuals on our economics team, right? the wealth gap represents the best indicator of the cumulative impact of white racism over time. All right, so we're talking about this relationship here, right? So we think about the wealth gap as indicated just by the holding of assets, but we should also think about it as determined by the significant holding of debts and the disparities in the holding of debts as well. And so when we think about those relationships, what we're seeing is that the racial wealth gap, broadly understood, actually is the best accounting for the cumulative impact of anti-Black racism in this country historically. So if the wealth gap is the best single indicator of the cumulative impact of white racism over time, it in principle represents a total sum of calculable harms. And this is where I began to mention this issue earlier to my colleagues. However, the task force interim report frames the racial wealth gap as a separate harm. And so this is the issue that we need to reconcile, in our body today, so that way we can make some, appropriate plans going forward. So we do not yet have an exact sense of what the specific racial wealth gap is in the state of California. However, we do know what the racial income gap is. And this is different. This is the difference between the wealth gap and the income gap. So what I'm saying is that we don't yet know what the wealth gap is in the state of California. Okay. So as far as the income gap, we see that Black Americans earn 60 cents for every dollar that white Americans in the state of California earn. Okay? And this has been determined by the Public Policy of California statewide survey. We also know the geographic disparities of wealth in the state of California, where 20% of all net worth is concentrated in the 30th wealthiest zip codes of the state, home to just 2% of Californians. So what we're talking about is that in the state of California, 2% of California's residents hold 20% of the state's wealth. Okay. So determining the specific racial wealth gap would take directed research, which is beyond the scope of work for the economic experts team in both time and capacity, as both have been allotted to them. In other words, they can do it. We have not given them enough time or resources to do it. Okay, and that's fine. It is also not appropriate to simply deduce a state-based number for the gap from a national figure, which I presented earlier. The reason is that many of the measurable variables do not simply correlate between national and state circumstances. I've asked the economic experts team to be here today so they can elaborate on these points if the task force would like for them to do so. Okay. Still, despite not yet having an exact figure for the racial wealth gap in the state of California, right, and with the wealth gap again being seen as the best indicator for the cumulative impact of anti-Black discrimination, the economics team has thus far identified 5 areas of harms, and we've been talking about those for some time now. As a reminder, those are unjust property takings, the devaluation of Black businesses, housing discrimination and houselessness, mass incarceration and over-policing, as well as health harms. And so what I want to explain is that the calculations for these 5 areas go some way in accounting for the total impact of the sum of the racial wealth gap. All right, so those 5 areas account for a portion of the total sum of the racial wealth gap. And so if we were to go away and study the racial wealth gap and come back with a figure, within that figure would be numbers from those 5 areas. Okay. And so to be clear and provide an update, the economics team has made progress on determining preliminary figures for, it was 3 of those 5 areas, right? So we have numbers for 3 of the 5 areas, which I'm not going to share today. Many of us know why. Media responsibility. All right. So for this meeting, what I want us to discuss is whether we should proceed with the 5 atrocities, what I mentioned earlier, and have them serve as a proxy for the wealth gap, as a primary form of compensatory reparations. Alternatively, I can use the next couple of months to draw on my professional resources, networks, and personal research agenda to further explore the state gap in consultation with the economic experts team. As a third option, we can proceed with the 5 atrocity figures to then be later supplemented by future findings on the general racial wealth gap. Sure. So the first option would be to stick with the 5 atrocities, right, which again represent some portion of what we would think of as the total racial wealth gap. Because a racial wealth gap should be understood as a cumulative impact of all discriminations against Black Americans in the state of California. So the first option would be to simply proceed with the 5 atrocity areas. And again, the economics experts team have calculated for 3 of those 5 areas. So we have numbers for 3 of the 5 areas, and they're on their way to finalizing numbers for the final 2 areas. The second option would be to say, well, let's actually pursue what the racial wealth gap in the state of California is. And so that would take considerable further research, some resources, and support. But it might be possible to make some progress on that in the next couple of months in time for us to make some final recommendations in time for the DOJ to help draft the report. The third option would be to take a kind of both and approach, which is to say, well, let's continue and make plans using the 5 areas, and then we can continue to do our best to further explore the actual number of the racial wealth gap, and then to use that to supplement the 5 areas. So those would be the 3 options. Okay. And so before we discuss that, I just want to quickly say that beyond closing the wealth gap, right, I suggest that we also create a series of attendant policies that support the accumulation of wealth in Black American communities. Right? It should be noted that the wealth held in white communities is in large part the result of such protections, advantages, and other support through preferential lending terms, the significant and long history of state and federal subsidies, as well as tax policies. So in principle, I will be proposing, policies in the areas of capital development, commercial development, community support and development, as well as significant infrastructural development in banking and investment. However, I should note that over the past 2 days, many of you have touched upon some of these areas. And so, that being really noteworthy and really wonderful to see that we are actively, despite our respective portfolios thinking, really along the same lines here. I think I would rather, go back and look at the presentations more closely that you all presented over these 2 days, and then provide some further, analysis and recommendations at the next meeting, because it doesn't make sense for us to duplicate our efforts. So, I will stop there and open it up for discussion and any kind of presentations or further clarifications that the economic experts want to provide.
Yes. Member Holder, you're recognized.
You might need to talk into them. Yeah.
Member Scott Lewis, given your expertise and your work with the economics advisors, what's your recommendation as to what is the most sound methodology to move forward with, especially given the fact that everything that we do has to be embedded in a sound methodology in order to pass legal scrutiny? So I'd ask for your recommendation of which of the 3 is preferable.
So the member holder is asking me which of the 3 paths do I personally suggest. So that's exactly right. We are trying to work towards, sound methodology. It's important because, Black Americans in the state who are part of the eligible community, deserve accurate accounting of their historical and contemporary harms, as well as we know that we have to, whatever we do has to withstand scrutiny from various other entities. So it makes sense for us to really, I think, take the third path, which is that in the spirit of accurate accounting, and in the spirit of making sure that what we do, stands up to any further and future scrutiny, it's appropriate for us to continue the calculation while I think exploring the scope of how far we can go in determining an accurate account. That's my recommendation. The reason why, I would say that we might want to pursue option one, which is to say we have the 5 areas, let's stick to them. It's that we have, a lot of collective work to do. And as I noted, some of our work is beginning to overlap in a way where, we might very quickly come to a point where you rely upon, the figures from these 5 areas to then begin building out, your policy proposals and so forth. And so if we are in a position of continuing to add more numbers or to add, adding more areas, it might complicate the work. And so I think that's part of the issue. I was going to have them speak to it, but, there is also, the potential for these areas to more than represent. Can you say it instead? Because I don't want to, if I say it, then, it's a thing. But there's a relationship, Dr. Kramer, between the values for the 5 atrocity areas and then what we can, speculate might be the sum of the racial wealth gap in California.
The thing is, I would caution that the wealth gap, the federal wealth gap, is a good indicator of the effects of white supremacy, the cumulative effect of white supremacy throughout history. Whereas for the California wealth gap, that may not necessarily be the case, because there's always the possibility that selective migration may have caused the gap to be larger in California or smaller than the federal gap. Just as a made-up example, I have no idea if that's true or not, but if California would have attracted specifically poor African Americans from the southern states and rich white Americans from other states, maybe for the Hollywood industry or whatnot, then the wealth gap would be larger in California, but not necessarily because of anything California did, but just because of selective migration. So the federal wealth gap is a good indicator for the atrocities, cumulative atrocities on the federal level. But the California wealth gap may not be such a good indicator for the cumulative effect of atrocities that California is specifically responsible for. And I think that's why we initially went for the specific harms model and for the 5 atrocities. And I agree with you that, making the point that this is the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of a conversation. So the estimates of those 5 harms will be a start. There may be other atrocities that may become estimable if there's data available or if there's methods to be developed. So there should be an emphasis that this is an open-ended process into the future.
Just one quick addition to something that we'll discuss is just the resiliency of Black people in California undermines the racial wealth gap. People in terms of self-preservation have worked harder to try and overcome some of these barriers. So the harms within themselves might be undermined when we operationalize this through the racial wealth gap, just through our own efforts to try and overcome some of these issues. And another big issue also is the racial wealth gap as an accumulation of understanding white supremacy in the United States is good for calculation nationally. When it comes to kind of dwindling that down to California specifically, it doesn't have the same interpretation. For a lot of the reasons that you outlined, a lot of it in terms of migration, a lot of it in terms of resiliency that we talked about. So we have to be very careful when we look at the racial wealth gap nationally, which is a federal debt and a national debt, versus California government injustices might not be operationalized from a California racial wealth gap. And that's one of the main reasons why the expert group look specifically at harms or atrocity, where there is a group of individuals that were harmed and there is a perpetrator of that harm. And it's probably the most robust way and probably one way that's very defensible. There's somebody inflicting harm that we've identified, and we've identified the individual that has been harmed,
And we have also identified the atrocity or the harm and quantified it. So that's one of the reasons why we felt strongly going this approach rather than looking specifically at a national racial wealth gap.
Chair Brown, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of task force. Through the language of our culture, we ought to make this a 5-star, homes with 5-star solutions. We talk about going to 5-star hotels. When we think of the best, let's make this comprehensive and inclusive and make it 5-star. Old preacher in Mississippi got up one Sunday night and said, children, we're going to have a great time tonight. We're going to shoot for the moon. But if we don't reach the moon, we'll land between the stars and we will still be on higher ground. So let's stay on higher ground and shoot for the stars.
So you're suggesting
5 stars.
The first option?
That's right, first option.
Okay. And I think, and I thank you, Vice Chair Brown, and I think, you know, there is something really important for us to then recognize about the language that we're using, you know, and so when we think about the racial wealth gap, you know, again, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, as a discrete area in the interim report and as a discrete harm, you know, what we're hearing actually is that the language, you know, may not actually be as productive at the state level as it would, as it serves, you know, in a federal conversation around reparations. Whereas at a federal level, you know, the kind of predominant thinking is that the racial wealth gap alone is enough to satisfy what we can think of as reparations, right? However, at the state level, we do need to be a bit more specific because of the limitations of the histories and of the circumstances. So, you know, what I'm hearing is that what we may need to do is, and we have to maybe account for this in the final report, is we may need to better contextualize what the racial wealth gap means in the context of thinking about state harms. And so this is part of the issue that I wanted to kind of bring up today, which is that we can't just use the language in the same way as operates at the federal level compared to the state. And so, you know, we will have to then think about, you know, how we structure the final report, because what we do know is that these 5 areas that we've identified as being calculable come out of the total sum of a dozen or so areas that are in the report. So we would just need to think, I think, very, very clearly and considerably about how to frame that while thinking about the general economic disparities that continue to exist, which might show up in other measurements.
Yeah. I'm thinking out loud what this is reminding me of. Instead of, for instance, using the language of a racial wealth gap, what about like a state-based study to determine what the lineage wealth gap is? Because to your point, when you read chapter 13, there is no study around what the racial wealth gap is between white Californians and Black Californians. The only data that exists is the Color of Wealth report that was actually commissioned by Dr. Darity, amongst other economists. And so the only data as it relates to California that's similar to the racial wealth gap relates to the city of Los Angeles. And again, that's in the report as well, where we found that US-born Black Americans, so those who are descendants of slaves, for instance, have $200 in liquid assets, compared to, for instance, African immigrants in Los Angeles who have a median liquid net worth of $60,000. And that was in 2017. And so I know you laid out 3 different options, but again, just thinking out loud, instead of maybe, you know, we can do the 5 harms, but instead of, you know, looking into a race-based racial wealth gap study, looking towards trying to expand kind of the work that Dr. Darity already did with the Color of Wealth report. He did a Color of Wealth report in Los Angeles, Miami, Boston, but maybe it would look like doing like a color of wealth report lineage wealth gap study throughout the state of California.
So I think that's a great idea, and I think, you know, for our purposes, that should be part of the recommendation, right? I mean, because we do need to know these figures, you know. The idea for us, though, in as far as how we calculate, how we, you know, come up with a figure of compensation, we are dealing with limitations on time and resources. So I think it's absolutely appropriate for us to, you know, as part of, and I've written it down here. So what I will put in, you know, in my next draft of the recommendations is that we have a proper study. The idea is, I think we have the harm-based model as being a really good, you know, proxy for thinking about, you know, how to identify what at the federal level would be seen as the racial wealth gap, you know, as the kind of carrier of the cumulative discriminations against Black Americans. And so, you know, to answer your question finally, Member Holder, right, I think what I would want to do is to continue, right, with the five atrocity model, you know, continuing, because, you know, the economics team still has 2 areas to calculate. However, I would want for us to at least be open, you know, to as more data becomes available, you know, as they're able to go about their work and we continue to meet, it is quite possible that we can find more information. And so I just don't want to close the door on our ability to say, well, here are the areas that we can seek compensation for. And it's important to note that that's really where we are. So those 5 atrocities, you know, those are the areas of the dozen areas in the preliminary and interim report that we can faithfully come up with some numbers for. It is quite possible, correct me if I'm wrong, it is quite possible that, you know, as we continue to do our work, we might be able to come up with figures for other areas. You know, we can think about the educational impacts or the economic impacts of educational disparities as being one area that might prove, you know, potentially viable for calculation and therefore, you know, financial recommendation. But at the moment, we have the 5 areas. We've completed 3, or the team has completed 3 of the 5 areas. And so what I'm asking for is that we stick to the 5 areas with, you know, an opportunity to continue to explore as they go about their work. Is that fair? Okay.
Attorney Brown.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just also wanted to supplement some of what Member Lewis mentioned. DOJ is still working with the state in compiling the data requests that the experts have made, and that may also be informative to this discussion in terms of what data is available to continue to do these calculations. And so as that data comes in and we anticipate being able to complete the gathering of that data relatively soon, then again, that may further inform what it is that you do. In addition, you know, we'll constantly, and this goes to all of the advisory committees and the work that you're doing, continue to track for potentially shifts in what was presented in the first iteration of the report to make sure that it's consistent with the final recommendations that are being made.
It's very helpful. Thank you. And so in a way, I think what I'm just trying to impress upon, you know, my colleagues is that the idea of the racial wealth gap, it functions within the context of the report and within the context of what we're doing in the state as somewhat of a redundancy, given the fact that we are using the other areas in the interim report to base the calculations, right, or to base, you know, what we will recommend as the calculations for the compensatory form of reparations, you know, in our final recommendation. So I just wanted to effectively help to contextualize and prime everybody for the fact that we may need to, you know, think differently about the particular category of the racial wealth gap and how it shows up in the final report, because in many ways it's already being accounted for in the preceding categories, which many of you are currently working on.
Member Grills, you're recognized.
Thank you. I'm all in favor of your recommendation of the both and, but I'm still feeling the Jesse Jackson phrase, keep hope alive. On the 6th harm, which came out extremely strong in the community listening sessions, and which also in the academic literature is pretty strong, which is educational harm. And I know that when I raised this in our last meeting, you shared that it's pretty difficult to find the indicators that would allow you to include education as a factor. But I'm wondering whether or not we might think a little more creatively about how to do that. For example, I understand within economics that the correlation between years of schooling and income is probably one of the most robust findings of all empirical economic research. And is it possible to come up with some kind of modeling using that as a framework, or using administrative data that we would have access to in the state of California? For example, looking at teacher quality, school finance, and API, academic performance index scores, to become like a composite measure. And then what would be the calculations of income lost, if you will, and therefore the harm done in that regard. Or one other option, thinking about how to calculate harm using the perspective of lawyers or the legal community, which they come up with amounts of harm all day long for case after case, and they're not relying on complicated economic literature and indices, but it passes the litmus test within the legal system. So I just want us to not completely toss that out, that I agree with the 5-star, but I think a 6-star would shine even brighter.
Right, in terms of calculating out damages with education, this is something the group has talked about quite extensively. Modeling that in a way that allows it to not be too speculative, especially in this framework, is difficult. A legal case with one individual and calculating damages is different, and we can't really use that framework to look at county and school district and areas that are very different across California. We have thought about it, and one thing that we did say is, and even between yesterday and today, we've seen quite a bit of proposals and recommendations, and I think at a later date, a conversation about quantifying some of those proposals and having a sense of if there's something very specific in the education model. So one proposal we saw earlier was about free community college and the UC system that is to deal specifically with a harm. If we're able to quantify that, then it closes that gap. Even though we might not have that 6-star, essentially, we have kind of taken that into account with some of the proposals that this task force has already gone through and presented. And as we were watching, we were looking at some of those. We haven't quantified them just yet, but they are dealing with harms, even though we have not identified them in the 5 or 6 or 7 or 8-star, wherever we end up. But this task force has taken into consideration quite a bit of proposals, quite a bit of policies that are in fact dealing with these harms. We haven't quantified them, but these proposals are tangible ways to kind of close these atrocities or harms. So I wanted to point that out. We might not identify them in the list, but the task force has come up with proposals that have in fact dealt with some of these harms that are not in the list. And at some point, we should probably do a reconciliation process.
No, I mean, I'm just seeking some guidance, just how to continue to do the work, and I got it. Yeah.
Okay. So, do you feel like you got sufficient guidance?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Awesome. Thanks so much, members.
Thank you.
And to the economists as well. Thank you, Professor Kramer and Professor Campbell. Vice Chair Brown was just applauding and commending Professor Campbell. She's been incredibly brilliant throughout this process. And Kramer. Thank you. Woo. Okay, the next item on the agenda is item number 23, Subpoena Advisory Committee Report and Recommendations. Presenters, Member Holder and Tamaki with DOJ's Research Center.
This has been an information-intensive meeting, so I'm going to keep this extremely short. I don't think we need to pile on. I think our brains are hurting. But as you know, that Member Tamaki and I have been using our quote-unquote subpoena power to get data and data sets from the prosecutors, the 50 some odd prosecutors' offices in the state of California, and all of the courts, the superior courts in the state of California, and the city attorney's offices in the state of California, data sets regarding race and what kind of data the criminal legal system through all of those prosecuting entities, how they are collecting race data. So we sent out questionnaires. We got almost 100% response after some legwork by the DOJ from the superior courts all over the state, the district attorney's offices all over the state, and the city attorney's offices all over the state, that gave us an idea of exactly what data they are collecting on race. And what we're seeing, and I'm just going to use very, very broad brushstrokes, we're seeing hundreds of things, but I'm going to give you the one standout point that we're seeing. We're seeing a lack of uniformity in what's being collected. Why does that matter? Because in order to do a proper analysis, you need some level of uniformity to fully understand the landscape of how race is informing decision-making at every level of the criminal justice system and at every level of prosecution. So when you have a lack of uniformity that we're seeing, it's harder to come up with a sound analysis of exactly how the inequities are playing out. And so what we would like to do as an advisory committee is do a little bit further study, because ultimately we are going to come up with recommendations to see if we can create a uniform system of data collection around race, lineage, etc., in all of these entities. And so the next step is probably one more step of vetting to find out exactly what's being collected, and making it much more making our questionnaire this next time much more targeted if we decide to roll this out as a second follow-up questionnaire. We are still working with analysts and subject matter experts who have tremendous expertise in the Racial Justice Act and really have a profound understanding of how the data that is being collected by prosecutorial entities informs their work to apply the Racial Justice Act and ensure that people who are being unfairly prosecuted have a mechanism to get compensation and to get their convictions overturned if necessary. So they have been our thought partners on this. We're continuing to work with them to figure out what is the best next step to help us refine the recommendations that we're going to roll out about the best ways to implement the RJA in a way that's most effective for system impacted people. So I don't think we need to make a motion at this time. We have been given the power by this body to continue this research, and so we're going to ask to take one more step along those lines, and then come back to this body with final recommendations. I'll turn it over to Member Tamaki. Just
I think that's fine.
Follow-up.
You know, the response has been excellent, really. I mean, there have been 2 or 3 counties that have not responded, 100% response from the courts. It's been an eye-opener. Most of the prosecutors collect data on the race of the defendants, but surprisingly, there are 4 and a couple of large counties that have they do not collect data on the race of the defendants. And without that information, just to give you an idea, if you are a defendant and you think that you're been victimized by bias, without the comparative data, you can't enforce the Racial Justice Act. That's how important the data is. And there are other things that are missing. We're finding out almost no one collects data in connection with the victim, the race of the victim. And practitioners tell us that matters in terms of how vigorously the case is prosecuted. If the victim is a white victim, there's a disparity, practitioners say, as opposed to if the victim is black. So again, these kind of things are helpful in enforcing rights in the Racial Justice Act. There a bill has been passed called the Racial Justice Data Accountability Act. I believe that's the name, something like that. That wasn't in effect when we began the process. And so the data that is mandated to be collected in that act mirrors what we asked the counties in our survey. But that act is not going to be going to effect for 5 years. So the information that we're getting now, I think will be helpful. It'll be public information. We need a longer agenda time to roll it out, and we need more time to work with the advocates and others to evaluate what we have and determine the next step.
Comments or questions? Okay. Thank you all for your incredible work, and looking forward to a comprehensive update at our next hearing. So the next item on our agenda is...
Chair Moore?
Oh, sorry, Member Jovan Scalowitz, you are recognized.
Sorry to interrupt. I've just learned that today is Dr. Casey Campbell's birthday, and she's here doing the work. Happy birthday, Dr. Campbell. We talk about commitment. Thank you so much.
Happy birthday. Okay, so the next item on our agenda is number 24, discussion and action item, next meeting agenda. So we have the potential agenda up for folks. So basically, from a review of this potential agenda for January for our Friday, Saturday, January 27th and January 28th hearing in San Diego, the agenda looks very, very similar to the agenda for these past 2 days, where there are essentially additional report backs for each of the advisory committees. And then at the end, there is an evening event that we could talk about, but we can go section by section, I guess, if that helps. And then we'll ask folks if there's any additions or subtractions. So for, if we go to the second page, so the first item of the business is call to order, then it's public comment, then it's the approval of the December minutes. And then as the first day, it started off with a report back from Jovan, Scott Lewis, and I on the experts 5 key questions. And I would presume that would also include now the fiscal component as well. Okay. And then the next report back is from Member Grills on chapters 2 and 8, then lunch. And then it's a report back from members Bradford and Montgomery Step on chapters 5 and 10. And then number 8, a panel continuing the conversation with local municipal reparations efforts, then a break. The 10th item is the Communications Advisory Committee, and so that needs to be updated to include the new members of the committee, which is Senator Bradford and Jovan Scott Lewis. And then number 11 is the report back on educating the public in formal apologies with Tamaki. Okay, and then DOJ updates, dinner break, and then at the end, it's supposed to be personal testimonials of individual harm supporting the need of reparations. So that was the evening event that was supposed to happen this evening, but was pushed back until January. So we can have a conversation as to whether we want to keep this on January 27th at the end of our hearing, or whether we want to, postpone it for February or some other time. And then the next day, again, looks very similar to what happened today. So it opens up, again, call to order, public comment, a report back from members Holder and Jones Sawyer on chapters 11 and 5, a report back on chapters 2 and 9 from myself, lunch, and then a report back from members Montgomery, Step, and Bradford on chapters 4. And then it goes to a report back from Vice Chair Brown, member Tamaki on health harms and education, then a break, and then a report back on the wealth gap from member Lewis, and then an update on the Subpoena Advisory Committee report, and then a discussion and action item on the next meeting agenda, unfinished business, and then closing remarks. So just, do we need to make a motion to change the agenda to correct the new, or to update the new comms people? Or that's just going to be administratively corrected?
No, we can take care of that.
Okay.
We can.
Is there any other updates, change? Okay, member Montgomery, Steph, you are recognized.
One is, if we are having the meeting at the place we hope we're having it, it will be at San Diego State University. If the members are okay, I would like to add the Secretary of State in here to just do some welcoming remarks. I don't know if we need to agendize that, but it might be just good so that, she has a little bit more time than public comment. So that would be one thing. The other thing I brought up yesterday is that with regard to the 5 questions that we really have to discuss and make some decisions on, I know that we've had an initial presentation at this point, but my question would be, is an hour and 20 minutes enough to dig into that? I would say it's not. I think we should leave ourselves more time, but, and I don't know if that's a 2-hour conversation. I don't know if we leave 20 to 30 minutes per question. And then we're going to include the dive deeper into some of the economic proposals. So I just think we need to give ourselves a little bit more time with that, and either shorten 2 hours. Okay, Vice Chair Brown says 2 hours, so that's what it is, 2 hours. Shorten some of the other presentations, or if we have the comprehensive document where a lot of our recommendations are kind of building off of each other or very, very similar. I'm just trying to figure out a more efficient way to do that part. That's all. Sorry, I'm not adding more solutions, but.
One of the things we can do is we are going to work on putting that document or multiple documents together. We can also work with the chair and the vice chair in setting the final agenda before the next meeting to modify it if that meets your approvals. We can work with them to reset the agenda to build it around those final documents. So we have that flexibility.
One other thing, Member Montgomery Step, we will add a an item to the agenda that for special acknowledgements. We won't list anyone's name for the purpose of not trying to embarrass them if schedules change. But just like for this meeting, you know, we'll be obviously in your city. There may be other officials that may want to bring greetings, and we want to make sure that there's an appropriate slot for that to happen.
Member, who is it? Member Holder.
That I'd be interested in agendizing, not necessarily at the next meeting, but perhaps the meeting after that. And one of the things that I'd be interested in pursuing is having experts come in who are actually implementation experts, who could give us some greater sense of the viability of some of our proposals. I know that the proposals that we did around housing, for instance, proposals that involve mental health, are sort of areas where, you know, implementation is key, and in terms of the success, in terms of positive outcomes. And to the extent that we have framed these proposals without having that conversation, I feel a little bit at a deficit. So while we have the resources to get that expert input, I think it would be great to take an opportunity to do that.
Member Grills?
I'd like to see if we could revisit the item number 14 on day one, which is the personal testimonies, and give an opportunity for the new communications advisory group to communicate with, well, to talk with the communications firm, because there was we were starting to get into discussion about what would be the most effective way to showcase the personal testimonies and have the greatest impact. And it may be that doing a special all day during Black History Month with targeted, you know, outreach to media, et cetera, might get more visibility than at our task force hearings. So I don't know how much time we need. I don't remember the time frame for finalizing the agenda before it has to go public, but I would like to see if the new committee could explore the best way forward on that one.
Can I add a comment to that?
Recognize.
Thank you. So I think we can move, have a motion that makes it, it gives us the option. And when we, in September, talked about this concept of personal testimony, and it's beyond public comment, it's actually featuring folks who have an experience that they've gone through. You know, their family or themselves, or, you know, that it's the human story that would typically have wide appeal. I think a good example of that, despite the controversy that the New York Times article set off beyond the New York Times, it was a good example, I thought, of the Russell City displacement. It was a human story of what people went through. They lost property, they suffered, they got displaced. And there are lots of stories like that. So it really does require those selecting the best ones, frankly. And when we talked about the idea in September, we did not have a comms consultant in place. And subsequently, by October, November, Shauna Charles came on. And I had a conversation with her, and she says, you know, rather than have this event sort of competing with the hearings, it really, she thought, would be best to be a standalone, separate event and tied to something more newsworthy than the hearings. And that would be, I know Chair Moore mentioned Black History Month. Pastor Brown mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation, or something that we could tie it to in a way that it could be produced professionally, and then also a lot of effort would be to just promoting just that as the event. So when appropriate, I think a motion that the agenda would have the flexibility to allow us to talk to Shauna Charles, and if that continues to be a viable professional advice that you would give us, that the task force would have the option to change the agenda from an evening event and rather allow her to produce a separate standalone event if possible. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. I definitely agree. So should we at this point just say we're gonna not include number 14 in the January agenda? I think that's fair.
That would be my recommendation.
We don't need a motion for that, right? Or, yeah.
Can I do have another suggestion?
Sure.
And this is more of a thinking out loud thing. So I did a panel with the American Bar Association on reparations, and what was unusual about it is there were two tax experts, federal tax experts, who spend their career basically advising ultra high net worth individuals in deferring or reducing their taxes. But they feel from a moral point of view that in looking at the evolution of the inheritance tax exemption, which is federal, it has expanded each year exponentially since the 70s, and to a point where now husband and wife can transfer without any tax whatsoever $23 million. I mean, it's enormous concentrations of wealth, and they felt that that would be a source of how you fund reparations. And going to the issue that Member Holder said about implementation, that's a question that we would have to answer at some point. The tricky part is that the legislators in California will have no authority to change the federal tax structure. But I would think as part of our recommendations that most of them will be California-centric and allocating what the harm is and what California's role in creating the harm, what California owes for that harm. But there should be, in my humble opinion, a set of recommendations about what Congress should do, about what the national legislature should do, and thought leaders and scholars like Professor Starity and Mullen have emphasized correctly, as well as others, that this is a national harm. Speakers have talked about that too. And so because it hasn't been taken up, and Congress to date has not even has had the political will even to study reparations, let alone do anything about it, the state of California has gone ahead, to its credit, thanks to our legislative leadership, and also municipalities around the country. But ultimately, we deal with our part here, but ultimately we need to also push other states to push this upward toward Congress. So the point of it is on the agenda, these two attorneys, Ray Odom and who works for Northern Trust, African-American tax law expert, and Sarah Johnson, also a tax law advisor. We might consider them on having a tax law panel, but I wanted to, disclose, of course, it's something for a recommendation toward the federal government. California legislature will have no authority whatsoever to change inheritance tax, but that is a huge, enormous generational transfer of wealth that happens constantly. So I would think that would be something we would want to hear, and whether it's in January or some other time.
Montgomery, step your record.
Member Tamaki, thank you for saying that. I think it was Mr. Newman and I talked briefly about this. I don't remember. It might have been either Attorney Brown, but it's about us incorporating some things that we believe the federal government should do. And even if that is an entirely separate document or under the statute. I don't know how we do that, but I think it's just important to send that message. So thank you for saying that.
I agree. I think at the October 2021 panel, I reached out to Professor Dorothy Brown, who wrote, she's a tax professor, a lawyer. She wrote The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans. She couldn't fit the panel in her schedule, but I agree. We need to have this conversation.
Timing wise, I think these two experts are available for the January hearing. Damon has been in contact. And so if it's appropriate.
They are available. And to the extent, Chair Moore, if we need to follow up with the other individual, we can to see if they're also available.
Chair Moore.
Member Joint Sawyer recognized.
Just a point of information, the Senate and or the Assembly can do a resolution to the federal government asking them anything or demanding anything that the legislature so deems necessary. So if there's something that come out of this committee that we want to urge, recommend, demand that the federal government do, we should include that and then make sure that someone in the legislature go ahead and put a resolution together making that happen, on the federal level, to at least do that. Don't just do it in a report, but memorialize it, and then that draft is sent to the federal government and to the Congress, and then ultimately the president.
Yeah, and to the point, just to add to your point, I mean, the inheritance tax exemption is at the highest in America's history. And it was far below this in the 30s and the 40s when this started, and began to accelerate upward in the 70s, and continued in the 80s and 90s and through the Wall Street boom, and it's just gotten wider. And I think very little attention has been focused on that. So that might be appropriate for us.
Member Holder, you're recognized.
Yeah, going to this point of like looking at the federal nexus, like some sort of synergy between what we're doing here and what we would like our federal representatives to be doing in Washington, and putting together some sort of resolution to instruct them on what this task force and what our legislature thinks they should be doing to further the cause of reparations. I think we need to institutionalize that process. And perhaps when we are reporting back on our respective portfolios, we should be thinking about that federal nexus. Member Joan Sawyer and I thought about it a little bit in terms of qualified immunity, because that's a federal issue. And I think that we should keep grappling with that and thinking about that, and maybe report back for each of our respective portfolios what is something that we would like to include in a resolution to our federal representatives.
Thank you so much. Attorney Newman, do you have any thoughts on that part?
Taking notes. So I will want to clarify exactly what we're adding to the agenda, or really what the agenda is, not specifically to which agenda item. So are there any other ideas that I need to?
Based on my notes, it seems like people want to extend the 5 questions advisory committee conversation to 2 hours. Is that what someone said? 2 hours. We're no longer having the January personal testimonial event in the evening, and then a conversation to add the experts on tax law. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I have. Oh, sorry.
And the federal nexus is related to that.
Yeah, and perhaps other implementation experts as well.
Oh, right.
So I have 2 expert panels, which is local reparations programs, which is already agendized, and then reparations implementation, or implementation of programs. So 2 different witness panels. Further report out on the policy recommendations for each of the advisory committees, potentially, depending on what that document looks like, sort of consolidating recommendations, but we'll see. 2-hour extended discussion of the 5 questions in monetary reparations that committee, advisory committee, is already doing, and then this tax law panel on the impact of reparations. with the 3 witnesses that have already been mentioned. Am I missing anything? Dana?
There was one item, and I apologize, I briefly stepped out, where Senator Bradford had recommended a discussion of something to take place during the January meeting regarding the task forces, extending the task force. Does anyone recall specifically what the request was? I just wanted to flag it just as we're setting the agenda.
Member
I
Jones,
don't really want to flag it since nobody wanted to do it before, but I'll go ahead and mention it. The fact that I put a bill in to make sure that this task force stays intact long after the June 30th for the legislative part. Because once they're gone, there are only 2 people that will be able to have an impact. That's Mr. Bradford and myself. And I just thought it was unfair for just the 2 of us to have that. But, and I'll make it clear, some individuals thought I was going to delay their check. Or people went out and told people I was going to delay their check. And so Mr. Bradford is bringing it back, or would like to have that discussion back, because he said, let's discuss it. That's fine. But I'm just letting you know how it got misunderstood.
Does anyone want to entertain a motion? I know Bradford's not here, but we are all here, so. Vice Chair Brown, you're
The
recognized.
suggestion was we would discuss it in January. That's it.
So, is that a motion?
I guess the question is agendizing it for January for discussion and potential action.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's consensus, we'll do that, yeah.
And I think the motion is for all of the items that Chair Moore referenced and that we've talked about in terms of creating the agenda, not just specifically that item. We'll add that to the list of others.
Again, and just one other point of clarification, no longer having the evening personal testimony on Friday night.
Yeah.
Okay. All the ducks in a row.
We need to make it like a motion to incorporate all these edits. Yes, Member Groves, you're recognized.
You want me to make a motion?
Yes.
Okay. I move that we accept the agenda with the additions, edits, and deletions for the January meeting.
It has been properly moved by Member Grills and properly seconded by Member Montgomery Stepp that we approve the January agenda with the aforementioned edits, deletions, and additions. Is there any discussion on the matter? Hearing no further discussion, I'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for a roll call vote.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The first member to be called is Chair Moore.
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Vice Chair Brown?
Aye.
Vice Chair Brown votes aye. Member Bradford? Member Bradford is absent. Member Grills?
Aye.
Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder? Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Jones Sawyer? Not voting? Member Jones Sawyer is not voting. Member Lewis?
Aye.
Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Stepp? Aye. Member Montgomery Stepp votes aye. Member Tamaki?
Aye.
Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there are 8 members present and voting. There were 7 ayes and 1 not voting. And no nays.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. There were 7 ayes, 1 abstention, no nays, 1 member not present. Thus the ayes have it and the motion carries. So the next item on the agenda is item number 25, which is unfinished business and potential action. Attorney Newman, you're recognized.
One item ending the agenda is please provide us with your witness suggestions for these two panels. Again, there's local reparations programs and implementation, two panels, or we have the three suggestions for the tax panel, but for those other two panels, please provide us your witness suggestions by ideally next Wednesday, Thursday, hard deadline Friday. We're going to need to vet them and schedule them, and that's going to happen through the holidays. So it's really important for us to get those from you as soon as possible.
Member Gross, you're recognized.
I just want to make sure, I think you already have the contact information for San Francisco and Palm Springs for the.
Is there any unfinished business? I don't think so. Okay. Sorry? Yes, the next item on the agenda is to adjourn the meeting. Thank you all so much for coming. Let's give a clap up for City of Oakland for hosting us. Please excuse us for any of the audio delays, any folks who had accommodations who had some trouble getting them. Any last thoughts from the task force members before we adjourn?
Thank you, Chair Moore, for running an efficient meeting. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I have a flight to catch, so I'm just kidding. But yes, thank you so much. Meeting adjourned. No.